Canada's history does not begin with European arrival, but stretches back thousands of years into a deeply rich and complex world of Indigenous civilizations who lived, migrated, hunted, traded, and built spiritual and cultural systems across vast landscapes of forests, lakes, mountains, and tundra long before the idea of Canada ever existed. Archaeological evidence suggests that the first human presence in what is now Canada may date back over 15,000 years, when ancient peoples migrated from Asia across the Bering Land Bridge during the last ice age. These early inhabitants gradually adapted to extremely diverse environments, forming distinct cultural groups that would later be recognized as the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Each group developed unique languages, belief systems, and survival strategies shaped by geography. In the Arctic regions, the Inuit built a life around hunting marine animals such as seals and whales, creating tools and clothing that allowed survival in one of the harshest climates on Earth. In the forests and Great Lakes region, the Haudenosaunee-Irkoperes developed sophisticated political systems based on collective decision-making, while the Algonquin-speaking peoples created extensive trade networks and seasonal migration patterns. Far from being primitive societies, these civilizations had complex governance structures, oral histories, spiritual traditions, and ecological knowledge that maintained balance between humans and nature for centuries. As time progressed, these indigenous societies continued to evolve, establishing alliances and sometimes conflicts over land, hunting territories, and trade routes. Long before European contact, vast trade networks connected indigenous nations across what is now Canada and even into the continental United States. Items such as copper from the Great Lakes, shells from coastal regions, and crafted tools were exchanged over long distances. Spiritual life was deeply connected to the natural world, with ceremonies honoring animals, seasons, ancestors, and the land itself. Storytelling served as both education and preservation of history, passing knowledge from generation to generation without written language. This foundation of civilization would soon face its greatest transformation with the arrival of European explorers in the late 15th and early 16th centuries. The first recorded European contact with Canada is often associated with Norse explorers, particularly the Vikings, who around the year 1000 CE established a short-lived settlement at Lonsoaks Meadows in present-day Newfoundland. However, this settlement did not last, and Europe's sustained interest in North America would not begin until the Age of Exploration several centuries later. By the late 15th century, European powers were driven by competition for trade routes, wealth, and territorial expansion. The fall of Constantinople had made access to Asian trade routes more difficult, pushing nations like Spain, Portugal, France, and England to search for alternative paths to Asia. It was in this global context that explorers began sailing westward across the Atlantic Ocean. One of the earliest significant European explorers of Canada was John Cabot, an Italian navigator sailing under the English flag, who in 1497 reached the coast of Newfoundland. Believing he had reached parts of Asia, Cabot's voyage instead marked one of the earliest European claims to North American territory. Although his expedition did not establish permanent settlements, it opened the door for future exploration. Throughout the early 16th century, French explorers became increasingly active in the region, particularly in search of valuable fish stocks such as cod, which were abundant off the Atlantic coast. Fishing stations began to appear seasonally, and contact with indigenous peoples gradually increased. A major turning point came with the voyages of Jacques Cartier, a French explorer who between 1534 and 1542 made several journeys into the Gulf of St. Lawrence and along the St. Lawrence River. Cartier is credited with naming the land Canada, derived from the Iroquois word Canada, meaning village or settlement. During his voyages, Cartier established early contact with indigenous groups, including the St. Lawrence Iroquoians, and attempted to claim the region for France. Although he believed he had discovered rich lands filled with resources and potential wealth, his efforts to establish permanent colonies initially failed due to harsh winters, limited supplies, and resistance from indigenous populations. Nevertheless, Cartier's explorations laid the foundation for France's future claims in North America. For several decades after Cartier's expeditions, French interest in Canada remained limited, focused mainly on the fur trade rather than large-scale settlement. However, by the early 17th century, France began to establish more permanent footholds in the region. In 1608, Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec City, marking one of the most significant milestones in Canadian history. Known as the Father of New France, Champlain established alliances with Indigenous groups such as the Huron-Wendat, which were essential for survival and trade in the new colony. The fur trade, particularly in beaver pelts, became the economic backbone of New France, as European demand for fur hats and garments grew rapidly. The relationship between French settlers and Indigenous peoples was complex, characterized by cooperation, trade, cultural exchange, and at times violent conflict. The French relied heavily on Indigenous knowledge for navigation, survival, and trade routes, while Indigenous groups used European goods such as metal tools, firearms, and textiles. At the same time, alliances formed during this period also pulled Indigenous nations into broader conflicts influenced by European rivalries. One of the most significant conflicts of the 17th century was the series of wars known as the Beaver Wars, primarily involving the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and French allied Indigenous groups. These conflicts were driven largely by competition over the fur trade. As European demand for beaver pelts increased, control over hunting territories became increasingly important. The Haudenosaunee sought to expand their influence, while the French worked to maintain their alliances and trading networks. These wars reshaped the balance of power across the region, leading to population displacement and long-term changes in Indigenous societies. Meanwhile, France continued to strengthen its colonial presence. Catholic missionaries, particularly Jesuits, arrived in New France with the goal of converting Indigenous peoples to Christianity. These missionaries often lived among Indigenous communities, learning their languages and documenting their cultures, although their presence also contributed to cultural disruption and disease transmission. Small settlements expanded along the St. Lawrence River, including Montreal, founded in 1642 as Ville Marie, intended as both a religious mission and trading post. Despite these developments, New France remained relatively small compared to British colonies in the south. The harsh climate, limited immigration from France, and dependence on trade rather than agriculture restricted population growth. By the early 18th century, New France consisted of a network of settlements stretching from Quebec to Louisiana, forming a vast but sparsely populated colonial territory. The balance of power in North America began to shift dramatically in the 18th century as tensions between France and Britain intensified globally. These rivalries were not limited to Europe, but extended into their colonial possessions. In North America, competition for territory, trade routes, and Indigenous alliances led to increasing conflict. This culminated in the 7 Years' War 1756-1763, a global conflict often considered the First World War, involving major European powers across multiple continents. In North America, the war is often referred to as the French and Indian War. British and French forces, along with their respective Indigenous allies, fought for control over the continent. Key battles took place across the Ohio Valley, the Great Lakes region, and Canada itself. Despite early French successes, the British gradually gained the upper hand due to stronger naval power and larger colonial populations. One of the most decisive moments came in 1759 with the Battle of the Plains of Abraham near Quebec City, where British forces under General James Wolfe defeated the French army led by the Marquis de Montcalm. Both commanders died in the battle, symbolizing the intensity and cost of the conflict. Following this defeat, French control in North America rapidly collapsed. In 1763, the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war, and France ceded most of its North American territories to Britain. New France ceased to exist as a French colony, marking a dramatic turning point in Canadian history. The territory that would become Canada was now under British rule, setting the stage for a new era of political, cultural, and social transformation. However, the legacy of French civilization did not disappear. French language, Catholic traditions, and legal systems remained deeply rooted in Quebec and other regions. Indigenous peoples, meanwhile, faced increasing pressure as British colonial policies expanded. The fall of New France marked not an end, but a transformation, one that would shape the future identity of Canada as a land of cultural duality, colonial struggle, and evolving nationhood. After the fall of New France in 1763, Canada entered a completely new historical phase under British rule. The Treaty of Paris had transferred nearly all French territories in North America to Britain. But what Britain gained was not a simple empty colony. It was a land filled with French-speaking settlers, powerful indigenous nations, and complex cultural realities that would shape the future identity of Canada for centuries. Britain now faced the challenge of governing a diverse population spread across vast and difficult geography. One of the earliest British policies was the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which attempted to stabilize the newly acquired territories. It established formal colonial governments and, importantly, recognized Indigenous land rights by declaring that settlers could not expand westward without Crown approval. This was a significant moment because it acknowledged Indigenous presence and ownership of land, at least in principle. However, in practice, this policy would often be ignored or gradually weakened as colonial expansion continued. The British also faced a delicate issue in Quebec, where the majority of the population was French-speaking Catholics. To maintain stability, the British passed the Quebec Act of 1774, which allowed French civil law and guaranteed religious freedom for Catholics. This decision helped prevent rebellion among French Canadians and ensured their cooperation under British rule. However, it angered many British Protestant settlers and became one of the contributing tensions leading to unrest in North America. During this same period, a major global event was unfolding: the American Revolution, 1775-1783. 13 British colonies to the south rebelled against British rule and eventually formed the United States of America. Canada played a crucial but often overlooked role in this conflict. British North America remained loyal to the Crown, and Canada even became a refuge for thousands of Loyalists, American colonists who supported Britain and fled north after the Revolution. These Loyalists significantly increased the English-speaking population in Canada, especially in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and Upper Canada and Ontario. This migration deeply changed the demographic and cultural balance of the region, creating a stronger British identity alongside the existing French presence. As the 19th century began, Canada was divided into two main regions: Upper Canada, mostly English-speaking, and Lower Canada, mostly French-speaking. Both regions developed their own political systems under British colonial control. However, tensions soon emerged between colonists and the British-appointed governors. Many settlers demanded more political rights and local control as decision-making remained largely in the hands of colonial elites. These tensions eventually led to the rebellions of 1837, 1838 in both Upper and Lower Canada. Reformers in both regions demanded responsible government and greater democracy. Although the rebellions were ultimately suppressed, they marked a turning point in Canadian political development. In response, Britain sent Lord Durham to investigate the causes of unrest. His famous Durham Report recommended two major solutions: the unification of Upper and Lower Canada into one political entity and the introduction of responsible government, where elected representatives would have real power. Following these recommendations, the Act of Union 1840 merged Upper and Lower Canada into the Province of Canada. While this was meant to reduce tensions, it also created new political challenges, especially between French and English populations who now shared a single government. However, over time, the idea of responsible government gradually took root, allowing local leaders more control over internal affairs. Meanwhile, Canada's economy was slowly expanding through agriculture, trade, and natural resources. The fur trade, which had dominated earlier centuries, began to decline, while timber, fishing, and early industrial activities became more important. Railways started to emerge, connecting distant settlements and laying the foundation for national unity. At the same time, Indigenous peoples were increasingly displaced from their lands due to expansion, settlement policies, and treaty systems that often favored colonial interests over Indigenous sovereignty. By the mid-19th century, the idea of uniting British North American colonies began to take shape. Several factors pushed toward unification, economic cooperation, fear of American expansion, and the need for stronger defense. The United States had grown rapidly and even purchased vast territories like Louisiana and Alaska, raising concerns that it might eventually expand into Canada. These pressures led to the most important political transformation in Canadian history, the Confederation of Canada. On July 1, 1867, the British North America Act united 4 provinces, Ontario, Quebec, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, creating the Dominion of Canada. This marked the birth of modern Canada as a self-governing entity within the British Empire. Sir John A. Macdonald became the first Prime Minister of Canada, and Ottawa was chosen as the capital city. Confederation was not the end of nation building, but the beginning of expansion. Over the following decades, Canada expanded westward, incorporating new provinces and territories. The construction of the Canadian Pacific Railway in the 1880s played a crucial role in connecting the country from coast to coast. This massive engineering project allowed settlers to move west, trade to expand, and federal authority to strengthen over distant regions. However, this expansion came at a significant cost to Indigenous populations. As settlers moved westward, Indigenous lands were increasingly taken through treaties that were often misunderstood or unfairly negotiated. Many Indigenous communities were forced onto reserves, and traditional ways of life were disrupted. Government policies during this period aimed at assimilation, including the establishment of residential schools, which had long-lasting and painful effects on Indigenous cultures, languages, and families. By the early 20th century, Canada had emerged as a growing nation with increasing independence. Although still part of the British Empire, Canada began to assert more control over its foreign policy and military decisions. This was especially evident during World War I 1914-1918, where Canadian forces fought under the British flag but gained international recognition for their contributions, particularly in battles such as Vimy Ridge. This war played a major role in shaping Canadian national identity. Following World War I, Canada gradually gained greater autonomy, culminating in the Statute of Westminster in 1931, which recognized Canada as a fully self-governing dominion. From this point onward, Canada controlled its own domestic and foreign affairs, although it still maintained symbolic ties to Britain. During World War II, 1939-1945, Canada again played a significant role on the global stage. The country contributed troops, resources, and industrial support to the Allied war effort. This period also marked rapid industrial growth and economic transformation. After the war, Canada entered a new era of prosperity, immigration, and urban development. In the second half of the 20th century, Canada continued to evolve as a multicultural nation. Immigration policies were reformed to attract people from Asia, Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, transforming Canada into one of the most diverse countries in the world. At the same time, Indigenous rights movements began to grow, demanding recognition, justice, and reconciliation for historical injustices. A major constitutional milestone came in 1982 with the patriation of the Constitution and the introduction of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which guaranteed fundamental rights and freedoms to all citizens. This marked Canada's full legal independence from Britain. Entering the 21st century, Canada has developed into a stable, democratic, and highly developed nation known for its healthcare system, education, immigration policies, and multicultural society. However, it also continues to face challenges, including Indigenous reconciliation, environmental sustainability, economic inequality, and global geopolitical changes. Today, Canada stands as a country shaped by thousands of years of Indigenous heritage, centuries of European colonization, political struggle, and peaceful nation building. Its history is not a single story, but a collection of many voices, Indigenous nations, French settlers, British colonists, and modern immigrants, all contributing to the identity of a nation still evolving in the modern world.